Hey, today is my turn to start the debate. Before I start, I just want to get a thumbs up that you can hear me on the other side. All right, all good. So the topic for today's debate is that we will never reveal the identity of an author published under a pseudonym. Today, I defined that we will never is that at no point will the government or individual organizations make efforts to reveal the identity of authors. I define author as book, media, newspaper. Everyone happy with that? I'm going to pass it back really quickly just so we can make sure that there's no issues with my definition of the debate and get David to check all his things through.
Hello, and yes, I don't have any issues with your definitions, so I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic back so you can make your case. Oh wait, something's wrong with my button. Okay, got it.
Okay, so today my case is that under no terms should we ever reveal the identity of an author for three reasons. Firstly, that the power of the pseudonym has always been a relegated term of literary function that we have used to allow authors to write freely. That's my second point, the idea of freedom of the author and freedom of art and creativity. And my third point of my case will ultimately be that pseudonyms allow authors to publish something greater than themselves, and that should never be diminished for the rights of an individual and their identity. So my first point will be that pseudonyms come in under this idea that the work itself is greater than the author. I think really great examples of anonymously published or pseudonymly published works are those such as Jane Bronte sisters. We also look at things like historically most pieces of news were published without bylines. Some news organizations still stick to that tradition, such as The Economist. Historically, really famous things like the Federalist Papers were also published under the pseudonym Publius. The main reason for anonymity is the belief that the written word is more important than the writer itself. So that's my case for today. I'm going to pass it back to David and see if he has any issues with it.
Okay, and just to be clear, my name's Noah, not David. I probably should change my name on CallOut just because of that. There's been some confusion. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and make my case. And essentially the main argument that I'm making here, under which pretty much everything falls, is that really there's not very much inherently valuable in a pseudonym. And in many cases, I would imagine, based on the stories of authors that I have read and that I will bring up, that a lot of them would prefer that their pseudonyms actually be revealed for a number of reasons, which I will be addressing in just a minute. But first, let's discuss why people actually choose pseudonyms. It's rarely because they believe that their work needs to be held above them, so they have to choose a pseudonym to hide themselves from their work. Instead, I have three big reasons why they choose them. The first is that of familial pressures. Now, we see in the case of people like Pablo Neruda, who was a famous poet from South America. I forget exactly which country currently. But he used a pen name because he wanted to hide the fact that he was writing poetry from his father, who had opposed him becoming an author at all. So when you're talking about him, it's not like my poetry needs to be separated from me. It's like, I don't want my dad to know I'm writing poetry, because that's the reason why. And that's not something that really gives it an inherent value as a pseudonym. Secondly, there are publishing rules. A lot of authors have chosen pseudonyms to hide from publishers the fact that they're writing multiple novels a year. And that's because publishers sometimes have stupid rules like you cannot publish more than one book a year. That's actually something that happened to, let me find him, Dean Koontz. Now in the 70s and 80s, publishers often had a one book, 1 year rule, so Koontz used pen names to write more books. And thirdly, the wording sexism. A number of cases, such as the Bronte sisters, faced issues where they weren't allowed to publish their work because they were women. And so what they did is they wrote under a man's name. Not only the Bronte sisters, but also Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the pseudonym of George Eliot. So these actually were intended to make sure that they could publish stuff as a woman without actually getting thwarted from actually doing that because of their sex. Which leads me to our second point, which comes down to the results of not revealing. Now, firstly, I'm going to deal with my first point, which is all I'm going to have time for in this speech, which is that if we don't reveal these people, then we won't be able to study and learn about them. Now, a lot of the time, we don't have no idea who these people were if we don't reveal them. We can talk about cases like B. Travin, who was an author who took this pseudonym, but we don't even know who he is anymore. And so we can't study or learn about his life. We're talking about taking that and taking all these authors' works who published under pseudonyms and not being able to study or learn about their lives because of that. I think that's a very serious harm. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic.
Okay, so first things I want to address in my rebuttal are that there is no benefit to the pseudonym because we have cases such as the Bronte sisters and the David Elliott case. I would argue that there are some considerable merits to a pseudonym to the author, also within the Bronte sisters. So we argue that under the case that we're given here from Noah is that the Bronte sisters were forced because of sexism to publish under pseudonyms, and that was inherently negative. I would always argue that yes, any norms that are sexist or derogatory or discriminatory, we are against as this house. However, pseudonyms currently are used for a lot more purposes other than relegating sexism. But however, if your job is to produce and propagate a piece of writing in a climate that is inherently sexist, the lack of access to a pseudonym would mean that you would not be able to perpetuate that work. So if we look at like Middle Eastern countries currently, why would like any individual want to remove someone's autonomy and ability to write in a hostile climate? And this brings back to my original points, right? So the inherent benefits of a pseudonym that we would like Noah would like you to disregard is that like society forces authors to take pseudonyms. I would give you like 3 examples where society doesn't force the author to take a pseudonym, but the pseudonym was taken by the author willingly and happily. So J.K. Rowling wrote after writing Harry Potter, she wrote under a pseudonym and said to publish without hype was a great pleasure. We also know that Daniel Handler, the famous author of Lemony Snicket, wrote under a pseudonym to propagate the idea of Lemony Snicket as a character in the far-fetched world of unfortunate events. We also know that cases such as the Bronte sisters could have been like completely overheard had they been worked as a hive mind, such as an economist-style authoring system where individuals work towards a title collectively, such as was done with the Federalist Papers, and like they publish under a group pseudonym. This would have also like diminished some of the arguments people made of like to diminish the cases that like we wouldn't pedestal the Bronte works had they not been put through the sexist struggle. The idea of a pseudonym itself provides the author a lot more freedom. You talk about someone not writing about because their father didn't like her. We also have the famous tale My Secret Life, which is about Victorian sexuality, without the publishing of which we would have had no insights into a strictly puritanical society, which I'll continue on to changing norms and how the pseudonym works within that in my next case. To you, Noah.
Okay. So I think what we need to do is start out by clearing up a couple of things. Now, first of all, I'm not saying that pseudonyms are bad or that authors shouldn't be allowed to use pseudonyms. In fact, I believe they should be. The problem is the resolution isn't saying pseudonyms are something that authors should be allowed to use. The resolution says we should never reveal the names of authors who choose pseudonyms, meaning that really what the resolution is asking us to prove and what the resolution is asking you to prove is that we should never reveal in the future the names of an author who's chosen a pseudonym. So pseudonyms are completely okay with me. The problem arises when you say that we can never reveal who used the pseudonym, which is where I'm going to be talking about the rest of this speech. Now I'm going to go back to my 3 reasons for not revealing people's pseudonyms. Reasons for revealing people's pseudonyms. Now, first of all, it leads to more study, which I already brought on in this speech. Now, you mentioned the point of the Federalist Papers where they wrote under the name Publius. Now, I think it'd be really strange to be a Hamiltonian scholar or to study James and not be allowed to access the Federalist Papers, just thinking, "Oh, here's this guy named Publius. He didn't want us to know who he was, so we can't actually research and study the works of James Madison in the Federalist Papers." That by taking that attitude, we're preventing ourselves from understanding more about the people that we're actually attempting to learn from and that we're attempting to study. Secondly, norms go unchallenged. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there have been publishing rules that prevented people from writing more than 1 book a year. And one of the reasons that actually went away was because people were writing under pseudonyms, and when that came out, people realized this is kind of a stupid rule. They're just going to write on names. They're going to write under other names. So that rule had to go away in part because of the pseudonym. If we don't reveal their pseudonym, then we leave that norm in place completely unchallenged by the author's use of the pseudonym, meaning that this pseudonym in this case becomes really purposeless in terms of societal change. All it does is enable the author to write more books. And thirdly, we end up having things like accidental research prohibited. Now, what happened was that Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, wrote a number of books under a pseudonym that got published in a periodical. Now, the reason that this is very interesting is because the fact that she was using this pseudonym was revealed in a search through her letters, and it found out that she had the pseudonym. So the scholars then had to publish this discovery. So what that means is if we don't allow people to make efforts and try to reveal people's pseudonyms, then what happens is we prohibit ourselves from doing research and learning about these authors more. That's the other consequence of it. We're preventing ourselves from learning more.
Okay, so the main reason I brought up why the benefits of the pseudonym was because you said they held very little or marginal benefit. But moving on to why we should never reveal. Firstly, the idea of like going through an author's private letters and revealing personal details of their business. I bring to my case the scenario that if I were to publish a story about horrific Tinder dates I'd been on in the past year and a half, while casting me in an unflattering light, would be written for social good. And if I was to publish that under a pseudonym, would be under my own volition and autonomous right to keep my identity private. We argue that the author, like access to information, as the author has created it, is not to be is not to be eroded for like access to like the idea of studying someone. The case of like you shouldn't have access to James Madison was the author of the Federalist Papers is one argument. The case should not the Federalist Papers be able to be held for their individual merit, which is why we shouldn't reveal the individuals behind pseudonyms at certain points. Right? Certain pieces of artwork throughout history are created not purely for the purpose of art or creation. People write things for things such as society. You talk about pressures and changing norms. I say that under a norm in which we write under a pseudonym believing that one day there will be a party of scholars who will actively research it, who we were, and try and find out our identity, I argue that the author has less motivation to write for external or existential means. I argue that specifically tales like My Secret Life, which was a Victorian homoerotic tale which changed the idea and perception of Victoria sexcapades, would never have been published had he known his identity would eventually be released. It is not my burden to prove that we should never reveal. It's my burden to prove that we should never reveal the identity of authors purely because it is like your burden to prove that it is more, but it's less. It is less detrimental to the works created if by doing so. I argue that under the status quo, revealing the identity of authors disempowers authors to write truly existential works that better society, or truly intimate works that better society, if we know that our identities will eventually be revealed. It also means that works do not get to stand alone free from who wrote them. I argue that that is one of the biggest benefits as to why we should never reveal the identity of a pseudonym, because if you reveal the identity, then you take away the power of people such as drug addicts, sex workers, strippers, homos, and marginalized community members to write freely if they think that one day their identity will be linked or shame or harm would be brought to those they love or near dear, and the societal harm would be greater because of that.
Okay, I have a couple questions if you don't mind answering them. So first of all, what was it that you said about the burden, like your burden and my burden earlier?
I said that I think that the idea of this case is that it's my burden to prove that it is better for the works themselves, and it's your burden to prove it is good for the works to be held individually themselves.
All right, and my second question is, are people still publishing intimate works that challenge societal norms today when they have the expectation of at some point having their names and identity released?
I would argue that like cases such as Belle or Jolie famously wrote the novels that based on Secret Diary of a Call Girl. She wrote like had a huge issue with like the idea that she would one day be disclosed. So, and we had insight into sex work. There are multiple works if you did wider research onto that.
Okay, so let's talk about the case. So you said a minute ago that it was my burden to prove that it's going to be best for the works themselves if we reveal the pseudonyms. Now, that's not my burden. I don't think that this resolution implies that we're talking about the works itself, because the resolution asks, we should never reveal the identity of authors who choose pseudonymity. It doesn't give us some kind of necessary burden. Here is what we're talking about in general. In fact, what I'd like to talk about more is the idea of like societal norms and how that's really challenged when we are able to reveal pseudonyms. So I talked earlier about the whole publishing thing, but there's a bigger norm here. And that was something that we brought up a little bit, the idea of sexism in publishing. Now, we talked about the Bronte sisters who published under a pen name because they weren't allowed to publish as women. Same thing happened with George Eliot, also known as Mary Ann Evans, the person who wrote things like Middlemarch and Silas Marner. So the idea here was that in order to actually gain respect as women writers, they had to publish under a man's name because their works wouldn't be judged equally or maybe even published if they wrote under a woman's name. Now, the problem is when we say that we can't reveal that, what we're saying then is that nobody's ever going to know that George Eliot wasn't a man, that he was actually Mary Ann Evans. And nobody's going to give respect to the woman who wrote that, meaning that we're actually enabling sexism in this case, because we aren't pointing out the fact that women who actually wrote this were equally capable, and we're taking that and hiding it, meaning that we're not allowing that fact and that realization to become a big issue. And so, sure, we can talk about enabling us to judge the works independent of the author. But when we're talking about something as important as our attitudes toward marginalized groups, I don't think that really compares. But even so, my opponents talked about a couple of major issues. And the first of all is that's kind of privacy. We shouldn't be going through authors' private letters and revealing that kind of stuff. Well, the fact is we do that all the time. Like pretty much any famous person who has letters, we're going to read them. And that's because we want to be able to study that history. And it's also because generally their descendants allow us to do that. Secondly, she talked about how the whole idea of we have to be able to judge works independent of the author. Well, this is just a fiction. We aren't judging works we're never going to judge works independent of the author, even when there is a pen name. Because if an author produces a body of work, then we're going to judge that work against the body of work about the author. We're always going to do that regardless of whether they write under a pen name or their regular name. We're going to try to judge the works based on the author anyway. So that point doesn't really apply. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic.
Okay, so as we're going to have the main tension being that it is better for the idea of research and society as a whole that we reveal their identities because of the author eventually. I didn't take this case to mean that we would go retroactively back in time and change the norms that were currently, like retroactively not know that the Austen sisters wrote the books or the Bronte sisters wrote their books. I took this as the stance for the future of like approach to pseudonyms. And because that was my future approach, I didn't understand that I suddenly had like this claim or burden to say that we would like go back in the past and not reveal like who the Bronte sisters were and like reverse sexism. But even if we were to make that case, right, there has been so many cases made to diminish like the works of feminism, and it wouldn't have been like pedestaled as much had we not been revealed that that Jane Austen was in fact a woman. There have been cases made multiple times that diminish female writers, that their works wouldn't have been held as highly had their identities not been revealed eventually as women. I would argue that is not inherently better or worse for female writers. I would argue that that's probably diminishes the way society in general would approach the works. If people are starting to cast doubt purely because we don't know if the hype is because they were a female writer at that time, I personally don't hold much validity in that argument, but it has been exposed enough times to say why like keeping their identities would be hidden. But that being said, I did not take my case at the retroactive. My second point would be like the idea that ultimately studying an author to a point of their body of works means that we could never have like an authentic pen name that provides anonymity has been disproven in my first examples given, such as Lemony Snicket. What I urge to prove in this case, right, in my last minute and a half, is that if we, as like this house proposes, that we do not reveal the identity of authors purely because we understand that author freedom is better for societal good, right? More things are created, and this is not, which is what hasn't been addressed, right? More works would be created from minority groups, from individuals who would be unlikely to write and put their name to it under the current framework if we did not have this understanding that we would eventually rifle through someone's mail. I think the burden then becomes, why should the ongoing norm be that we continue to reveal authors if we understand like there has been change in past societal change, and if we understand more societal change could be affected through true anonymity as a current understanding.
Okay, so to start out with, as Patrick Henry once said, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. The point of that quote is that the way we judge what we're going to do in the future is by looking to the past. And so when I'm talking about things that happened in the past, that's because I don't know what to talk about that's going to happen in the future, because the future hasn't happened yet. The only way I know how to judge what's going to happen in the future is by looking at the past and establishing what's probably going to happen. And so when we're talking about the resolution, we need to see what would have happened if we'd applied it in the past. Not just saying, oh, this might happen in the future, but what has happened and how does that compare to the resolution, the world that the resolution develops for us. So if we look at the issue of sexism and the sexist norms that happened, it really was true that in many cases, the fact that the woman was writing under a man's name first established her to get published and then established her to combat the norm that women couldn't write by actually showing, hey, look, I wrote it. You all thought it was a man's work, but it wasn't. That's actually how the Bronte sisters got published as women, because after they showed their publisher that they had written under a man's name, their publisher let them write under a woman's name, their own name, because he realized, yeah, they actually can write. So there is a value to revealing their pen names. It actually does help to combat norms. And it's not just sexism, it's also the publisher's norms and a lot of other kinds of things that I've talked about. Look, you can look at Voltaire, who wrote under a pen name Voltaire to hide his name from the French king and the Catholic Church, which he criticized. He thought they'd go after him if he had actually used his real name. So he used a pen name to hide that and make sure that they weren't going after him. Now, to say that he shouldn't have his pen name revealed, or anybody who writes for that kind of reason in the future, is a little ridiculous, because what value is it inherently in his pen name not being revealed? The reason he chose his pen name was to hide himself from institutions that are no longer a threat to him or to his family at all. So we should be allowed to reveal his pen name. The reason he chose it was not this whole idea of protecting himself from volatile societal things, but those things don't exist anymore and he's dead. So then the other argument that my opponent made was that the whole idea that there more works will be created if we don't study the people involved in them. Now, the problem is that she can't prove this at all. Now, as I questioned and asked her about, there are works being created under pen names that actually do criticize and reveal intimate and volatile situations. But we can't prove that there will be more works created if we don't actually study the authors that created them. That's simply something that we cannot prove. As we've seen, these things are created and have been created in the past under pen names, which have been revealed later, and that doesn't seem to have caused a big problem.
Okay, so in my final 3 minutes, I want to round up this debate and tidy up for the audience and for my opponent. I think the first tension in this debate is what is better for society, whether or not the identity of an author is revealed. My main points of why it isn't better for society, which have not been addressed or combated, are that we have more author freedom. I have proposed an idea that without the idea of future reveals of pseudonyms, that individuals will be able to create works free of social harms and stigmas. I've also used current examples of that going on. I've also used past examples such as the woman in Berlin, which still hasn't been revealed whose identity still hasn't been revealed. I also used a really current example of an ongoing pseudonym system, which is The Economist, who actually use a hive mind approach where they don't use bylines at all. The reasons all these examples are really valid from a case is it proves that the pseudonym creates and promotes content, because all those things that I have listed here, right, are at the front of the most consumed forms of media. The Economist itself is like a revolutionary form of communication, and we all know that. The main reason I wanted to raise that is also as the future content is like because of this idea of the new TED Talk, which is coming without presenters. I heard from my opponent that we couldn't hear about a universe in which like we couldn't prove what's going on in whatever resolutions. That's what all resolutions are based on. I have to make a case about what the future would be under my norm, and he makes a case about what the future would be under his norm, and we use the past to sample that. I think ultimately the idea that like stupid publishing laws were only revealed because like pseudonyms were revealed. Publishing laws would have been shifted eventually anyway, like because people would have made civil cases and all those kinds of things. What I argue is under my norm that by not revealing the identity of authors, we see more specialization of pieces created. We see more author freedom. We see authors having freedom to shift genres without all the stereotypical stigmas. We also see that because we do have a right to analyze an author's work free of critique, but the need to study them in relation to that work, it does not trump the right of the work itself to make social messaging, if that is the ultimate benefit that we want within this case, right? And then, like, I think ultimately he opened with a quote, and I was like, I think when J.K. Rowling says it is a pleasure to get feedback without reputation, that is not a point to be discouraged or unheard of, right? There is a true benefit to the literary community itself for pseudonyms not being revealed in a long-term scope, because it means that literary communities are able to develop internal to themselves, and that is better for education ultimately.
Okay, so I'm going to sum up the end of what I see as the main points in this round, starting with basically my 3 reasons why we shouldn't reveal people's pseudonyms. First of all, it prevents further study of these people. And the fact is, when we don't know who these people are, we can't study them very well. And that means that we can't really draw conclusions about their lives. We can't actually learn more about these individuals. And that's a really big problem for society, because a lot of the ways we learn about how lives happen, how history wasn't at all, was by studying individual people. And studying authors is a great way to learn about that. So we actually do learn about people, and that's a great thing that we should be studying. Secondly, it means that norms are challenged, which basically, if we have pseudonyms, people use those to challenge common norms. We talked about Voltaire, we talked about the Bronte sisters, we talked about Dean Koontz, and we talked about George Eliot. Those are people who use their pseudonyms to actually challenge norms. Just to be clear, the publishing issue wasn't a law, it was a publisher's standard created by the publishing companies. So there wasn't anything that you could have done about a civil suit in that case. So what this really boils down to is the fact that these pseudonyms are used to challenge norms, and they're only useful when they're revealed in the end. Thirdly, we talked about how research has to be conducted, but what you're doing when you say that we can't reveal pseudonyms is you're actually helping to prevent research from happening, because we revealed the pseudonym of, who was it? Louisa May Alcott quite accidentally. And so if we're constantly afraid of doing that, we can't really do research on these people at all, which is a significant problem. Even people who have forked over their letters to be researched were prevented from doing that by the possibility of us uncovering a pseudonym according to your framework. So at the end of the day, what we really have to consider is the fact that on the one hand, we have this idea that maybe we could have more author freedom. Well, and currently we do have a lot of author freedom. People publish under pseudonyms. Sometimes they don't get revealed because we just don't know who these people are. But I'm not saying that we can't use pseudonyms. I'm saying that we should not be prevented from trying to reveal and study the people who did use these pseudonyms. And because of the impacts I've provided, the idea of we really can study and learn about these people, and that we can actually learn more about these people and challenge.
So with my final 30 seconds, first I'd like to thank Noah for a really good debate and conclude my case while reiterating that the main tension in my debate is that the author's identity should not supersede the right of the piece, and that most pieces written under pseudonyms are done so for the right of the piece to supersede quo and the norms established. Other than that, I think it's pretty clear that pseudonyms provide a lot of merit. Thanks.